Welcome viewers. In this lecture, I will be discussing about organizational conflict, and the learning objectives is definition of organizational conflict. We will understand the views of different management practitioners on how conflict has been defined over a period of time. Then further we will also discuss about traditional and interactionist view of conflict and identify the situations when management should stimulate conflict and certain major sources of organizational conflict. So, conflict is a process in which one party perceives that another party has negatively affected or is about to negatively affect something that the first party cares about. Conflict arises due to differences in goals, interest, values, perception, or resources between individuals or groups. In organizations, conflict is inevitable because people work with interdependence of tasks, with a limited sets of resources and have a diverse perspective, opinion, viewpoints. So, we will try to explore the meaning and definition of organizational conflict. What is conflict and how it has been perceived by different management researchers. Conflict has been defined differently by different scholars as a distinct dimension, perception, process, interaction, power, or interest. Conflict is a perceptual process. A definition given by Stephen Robbins in the year 1997 states that conflict is a process which begins when one party perceives that another party has negatively affected or is about to negatively affect something that the first party cares about. Or the focus of conflict is that conflict exists when it is perceived. Objective reality is less important than the perception. And implication is even misunderstanding can create real organizational conflict. So, the conflict arises because of perception differences. Conflict as incompatible goal or interest. Coons and Verich has given another definition which says that conflict is the opposition of interest, idea or goals of people or groups, and the focus is incompatibility of goals, scarcity of resources, and the implication of this definition is departments competing for budgets or promotion experience conflict naturally because resources are limited and there is also incompatibility of goal as the genesis of the conflict. There is another definition given by Louis Pondy who states that conflict as a result of interaction and struggle. Organizational conflict is a dynamic process which involves a sequence of events or a series of events. The focus of this definition is conflict evolves through various stages. It is not a static event and but it is a continuous process. And the major implication of this definition is conflict escalates if it is not managed in an early stage. Karl Marx has also given another definition of conflict or conflict theory perspective, which states that conflict as a power and control mechanism. Conflict arises due to unequal distribution of power and control over resources. We know that within an organization, there are resources which are limited and also there are different stakeholders. Some are powerful, some have less power or influence. So, conflict arises when a dominant group has control or access over resources. The focus of this definition is authority and dominance and structural inequality. And major implication of this definition is manager-employee conflicts stems from the power imbalance or differences in the structure or authority and dominance. Conflict can also be construed as something which is emotional and affective experience, and the definition has been proposed by Thomas in the year 1976. Conflict is a process which begins when one party perceives that other has frustrated or is about to frustrate some concern of his, And the focus is on emotions and frustration, psychological reactions. And the implication is conflict involves feeling, not just tasks. Conflict is related to feelings and emotions and not just tasks. Conflict is also inevitable organizational phenomena as defined by Mary Parker Follett. Conflict is neither good nor bad, but it's a natural outcome of differences. Focus is on inevitability, integration rather than domination, and implication is conflict can be a source of creativity if it is handled constructively. Conflict can also be functional or dysfunctional outcome. Modern organizational behavior viewpoint says that conflict is functional or dysfunctional outcome. Conflict may be functional, that is constructive, or dysfunctional, that is destructive, depending on how it is managed. And the focus is outcome oriented definition. What is the outcome of the conflict? Whether it is related to performance, what is the outcome? Performance impact, and the implication is task conflict may improve decisions while relationship conflict harms employee morale. So, to summarize the definition of conflict given by different management scholars, their viewpoints when we try to assimilate, we get to know that Robbins' view, Stephen Robbins has focused on the perception aspect, and the key idea is conflict exists when it is perceived. Kuntz and Verich in 1990s, they focused on goals and interest perspective, and their key idea was incompatibility causes conflict. Louis Pondy in the year 1967 focused on the process of conflict, and they say that conflict is dynamic and not static. Karl Marx 1848 and 1867 has focused on the power relationship existing in organization, and his views are conflict arises due to inequality, imbalance in power or structural inequality. Kenneth Thomas in 1976 emphasized on emotional aspect of conflict, and his focus is frustration triggers conflict. Conflict arises when two parties are frustrated. And Mary Parker Follett has proposed that conflict is something which is inevitable and conflict is but natural. Modern OB view states that conflict focuses on the outcomes of conflict, and the key idea is dysfunctional or functional aspects of conflict. So, concluding this, the various definitions throw light on conflict is multidimensional. It is not one dimension that emphasizes on conflict, but conflict can be defined from the perspective of perception, goals and interest, process from the basis of power, emotions, inevitability and outcome. It involves various perceptions, interactions, emotions, power and outcome, and understanding these definitions help managers to understand or diagnose situations, manage and leverage conflict effectively. For managers, it is important to understand the definition of conflict given by different management practitioners, and these viewpoints will help them to understand the genesis of conflict, how the conflict has emanated, and how to manage conflict effectively. Perspective or viewpoint of conflict. So, organizational behavior literature explains conflict through three major viewpoints, that is traditional aspects of conflict, humanistic or behavioral viewpoint of conflict, and interactional viewpoint of conflict. Traditional views of conflict in organization, it emphasizes that conflict is harmful and must be avoided. Human relations view emphasizes that conflict is natural and inevitable outcome in any group. Interactionist view highlights conflict is not only positive but also absolutely necessary. So, let us understand these viewpoints. Traditional view, the core idea is conflict is bad and harmful and must be avoided or eliminated. And the assumption is conflict indicates poor communication. Conflict results from lack of trust or incompetent management. A well-managed organization should be free from conflict. Management approach in this situation is to suppress conflict, enforce rules and authority, emphasize obedience and harmony. This traditional viewpoint dominated during 1930s and 40s, and the limitation of the traditional views of conflict is it's unrealistic. Conflict is inevitable and suppresses creativity and innovation. It does not encourage creativity or new ideas to infuse, encourages passive compliance with what is existing. And one example is a manager discourages debate during meetings to maintain peace even when problems remain unresolved. Making situation manageable or peaceful is not always beneficial for organizations. We must encourage people to debate what is the existing status quo. Humanistic or behavioral viewpoint of conflict. The core idea is conflict is natural and inevitable and can be beneficial if it is managed properly. The basic assumptions of this viewpoint is conflict cannot be eliminated. Some conflict improves decision making, and focus should be on conflict management and not on eliminating the conflict. And various management approaches, behavioral viewpoint is to encourage open communication, resolve conflict through collaboration, negotiation, and focus on a win-win outcome where both the parties have equal opportunity to gain over the situation. The time period during which the behavioral or humanistic viewpoint has emanated is 1940s to 1970s, and their contribution is it recognizes positive potential of conflict, encourages participative management, and the major limitations are does not specify how much conflict is optimal. And an example here is HR facilitates dialogues between departments, resolve resource allocation disputes constructively. If there is a union management conflict, the management generally encourages open communication, confrontation meetings, town hall meetings to encourage discussion through interaction, communication in order to overcome the issues or the problems at hand. Interactionist viewpoint of conflict. The core idea is conflict is not necessary but is essential for effective organizational performance. And the basic premise or basic assumption is too little conflict leads to stagnation, and conflict stimulates creativity, innovation, critical thinking, and managers should actively encourage functional conflict. The interactionist viewpoint stimulates management approach is stimulate constructive disagreement, encourage questioning the existing status quo, and prevent destructive or dysfunctional conflict. Interactionist viewpoint dominated during 1970s onwards, and the focus area is balance between functional and dysfunctional conflict. One example could be leaders intentionally assign people with diverse perspectives to teams to generate innovative solutions. When you compare these three different viewpoints of conflict on the dimensions of view of conflict, level of conflict, managers' role and impact on performance, and how they perceive risk. So, we see that traditional viewpoint, the conflict is always negative and the level of conflict should be eliminated, and manager's role is to suppress conflict, and impact on performance is harmful, and the risk is suppression of ideas. They try to subdue the ideas if somebody wants to propose new ideas. Humanistic or behavioral viewpoint, the view of conflict is neutral and sometimes positive, and level of conflict is acceptable. Manager's role is to manage the conflict. On performance is to can improve performance. That means conflict can improve performance, and the risk is sense of complacency. Interactionist viewpoint, this view of conflict states that conflict is necessary and desirable, and level of conflict is it should be maintained. Manager's role is to stimulate functional conflict, and impact on performance is it enhances innovation and effectiveness. The risk associated is excessive conflict arises if it is not managed. So, to conclude here, the comparison of three different viewpoints of conflict, the interactionist view represents the most modern perspective, emphasizing that an optimal performance occurs at a moderate level of conflict, not at a zero conflict. Now, let us understand conflict and organizational effectiveness. Let us look at the relationship of conflict and organizational effectiveness. The term organizational conflict carries a negative connotation, as has been proposed by the traditional viewpoint. Effective organizations typically thought of as a coordinated group of individuals working towards common goal. According to traditional view, conflict would only hinder the coordination and teamwork necessary to achieve the organization's goal. But there is another view of conflict which is called interactionist view, which argues that conflict improves an organization's effectiveness by stimulating change and improves organizational decision making process. The traditional view of conflict assumes all conflicts are dysfunctional or bad. Any conflict therefore has a negative connotation, negative impact on organizational effectiveness. The traditional approach treats conflict simultaneously. The traditional approach treats conflict synonymously with terms like violence, destruction, and irrationality. So, in order to be consistent with this perspective, one of management's major responsibility is to ensure that conflicts do not arise, and if they arise, if they do, consistent with this perspective, one of the management's major responsibilities to try to ensure that conflicts do not arise, and if they do, to act quickly and resolve them. Interactionist view, and as an organization totally devoid of conflict is probably static. It is apathetic and non-responsive to the need of change. The interactionist view states that conflict is functional when it initiates the search for new ideas, better ways of doing things, and it undermines the sense of complacency within the organization. Change does not happen out of air, it needs a stimulus, and it needs a stimulus, and that stimulus is nothing but conflict. So, we will discuss about the conflict survival model. If you look at the conflict survival model, there is conflict, and the conflict arises because of certain sources of conflict, that is resource constraint or scarcity, role ambiguity, power struggle, change initiatives, performance pressure. And then conflict triggers change. Change is possible when people are dissatisfied with the existing status quo, existing state of affairs. Further change, or as a consequence, there is adaptation. When there is a disturbance in the status quo, then in order to make the organization or revive organization to make it functional, organizations have to adapt. Adaptation is changing according to the needs. There is maladaptation as well as adaptation. Adaptation leads to survival and growth, maladaptation leads to decline or failure. Then, when the organization is taking up a strategy of adaptation, survival, and growth, there are different survival strategies: avoidance, accommodation, competition, compromise, and collaboration. So, conflict survival model states that conflict arises when there is dissatisfaction with the status quo before conditions are right to initiate change. So, when an organization that is completely content with itself or complacent, it's conflict free, has no internal force to initiate change, then the sources of conflict could be resource crunch, resource scarcity or constraints, role ambiguity, power struggle, power tussle, change initiatives, performance pressure. For example, there are two departments competing for the same budget, employees resisting a new AI-based performance system. So, conflict arises. Conflict survival model consists of perceived conflict. Parties recognize conflict is a threat to survival, that is status, power, job security, performance. Line managers fear automation may reduce their authority. HR sees conflict between speed of business and compliance policy. Conflict response strategies can be like avoidance, which is nothing but ignoring conflict. Accommodation means yielding to others. Competition is winning at the other's expense, and compromise is partial satisfaction. Collaboration is joint problem solving. Conflict survival model, consequence of conflict handling. The outcome depends on strategy chosen, that is dysfunctional survival, which is short term, and functional survival, that is long term. Let us understand what is dysfunctional survival. Suppressing conflict or suppressed conflict, reduce trust, burnout, and employee turnover. Functional survival, which is long term, for example, innovation, learning, adaptability, improved performance. The survival outcome is maladaptation, that is decline and failure of organization. Adaptation is survival and growth. One example could be organizational survival situation. A company introduces AI based recruitment. The conflict happens when HR fears loss of judgment, managers fear bias and legal risk. Then survival strategy could be collaboration, like HR, IT, legal divisions, they integrate. Outcome is transparent AI governance, faster hiring and compliance, and the result is organizational survival through adaptation. The second situation or example could be individual survival or at an employee level. The situation is two high performers compete for one promotion, compete for a promotion, a position which is very limited. Conflict response is one chooses competition, that is politics, and the other chooses collaboration, that is skill development plus visibility, that means recognition and skill development. So, outcome is political employee loses trust, collaborative employee who has developed his competence as well as who is trying to gain recognition or reputation gains leadership role, and survival through competence, not conflict avoidance. So, it is possible that that an individual will sustain and survive if he develops his capacity, develops his competence, level of increases his skill sets, and then tries to perform, which will lead to his visibility in the organization, and rather conflict avoidance strategy would not help. So, why conflict survival model is important to understand? Conflict is inevitable. That means in organizational context, conflict is likely to be there. Conflict cannot be avoided. Survival depends on conflict management capability. So, what is important is managers need to know that we need to manage conflict effectively. Long term success requires constructive conflict, and let us also see the linkage between conflict and organizational effectiveness. If we have adopted a poor conflict handling capability, that which will lead to high stress, power struggles, low performance, and organizational decline. On the other hand, if managers have effectively handled conflict, which will lead to psychological safety, shared goals, innovation and agility, and sustainability and survival. Sustainable survival. Traditional versus interactionist view. Traditional view, management should seek to reduce the conflict. The interactionist view implies a wide role for managers in dealing with conflict. The manager's job is to create an environment in which conflict is healthy, but not allowed to run to the extremes. In the interactionist view, it is understandable for conflict levels to be too high or too low. Then, We will be discussing about three different situations of conflict A, B and C. Situation B represents the optimal level of conflict. So, the interactionist view, there are three situations, situation A, B and C, and the level of conflict can be low or none, optimal and high. And the type of conflict can be dysfunctional, functional, organizational. Internal characteristics can be apathetic, stagnant, non-responsive to change, lack of new ideas. Further, it can be viable, self-critical, innovative, and disruptive, chaotic and uncooperative. And then there is organizational outcome in terms of low and high performance. So, we understand that situation A talks the level of conflict is low or none, and the type of conflict is dysfunctional, and the internal characteristics of the organization is apathetic, stagnant, which is not responsive to change, and lack of new ideas, or ideas are not invited. So, the effectiveness is very low, or organizational performance outcome is very low. In situation B, the level of conflict is optimal and the type of conflict is functional. However, the internal situation is self-critical, innovative and viable. Organizational outcome or performance will be very high. And situation C talks about the level of conflict is very high and the type of conflict is not related to task, but it is relational conflict related to perception, it is related, or it is called dysfunctional conflict. Then organizational internal characteristics is disruptive, chaotic, uncooperative workplace. So, the organizational effectiveness outcome or performance will be low. So, conflict and organizational effectiveness, if you look at the figure, there are three situations A, B and C. On the x axis, we have level of conflict. On the y axis, we have level of organizational performance assessed on range from low to high, and the level of conflict is also assessed on low to high. The graph represents the relationship between the level of conflict and organizational performance or effectiveness under different management viewpoints. Explanation of the x-axis. X-axis is level of conflict from low to high, y-axis level of organizational performance effectiveness from low to high. The traditional view of conflict as represented in the dashed lines, it explains according to traditional view, conflict is always harmful. As the level of conflict increases, organizational performance continuously declines. And the reason or rationale behind this is conflict causes stress, hostility, breakdown in communication. Managers should eliminate or suppress conflict. Conclusion from this graph is zero conflict is equal to maximum performance, and the limitation is unrealistic assumption, leads to conformity, leads to lack of innovation and poor decision making. Interactionist view of conflict argues that some conflict is necessary for effectiveness. Performance increases with moderate levels of conflict, but declines when the conflict becomes excessive. So, there are three stages shown in the curve. A situation where low conflict leads to low performance, apathy, complacency, lack of creativity, poor decision making and resistance to change. Then there is situation B, which is moderate conflict, which leads to high performance. It is a zone of optimal performance. The situation here is healthy debate, constructive disagreement, improved problem solving and innovation, better quality of decision is being taken. The third situation talks about high levels of conflict, which leads to low performance, personal hostility or dysfunctional conflict, emotional conflict generally prevails, stress, absenteeism and reduced cooperation, and there is breakdown of teamwork. Comparison of traditional and interactional conflict. Traditional viewpoint, conflict to performance relationship, conflict always reduces performance and the managerial implication is eliminate the conflict. Interactionist view states that moderate conflict leads to optimal performance and the managerial implication is encourage the functional conflict. Conclusion from the graph: moderate or optimal conflict leads to maximum organizational effectiveness. Some key highlights are: too little conflict leads to stagnation, too much of conflict leads to chaos. So, when conflict is managed, constructive conflict leads to high performance. The conflict organizational effectiveness graph demonstrates that organizational performance is highest at moderate level of conflict, supporting the interactionist view and rejecting the traditional belief that all conflict is undesirable. Anti-conflict values permeate our society. It would be naive to assume that most managers today practice interactionist approach. Although there is an increasing body of research that attest to the value of conflict, most managers still follow the traditional approach, and the interactionist view therefore is undoubtedly prescriptive rather than descriptive. Managers are not comfortable with conflict. Why? So, answer lies in the fact that there is tolerance for conflict. Tolerance for conflict is counter to most cultures in the world. Across the globe, there is tolerance to conflict. We are susceptible to this influence of in the formative years of our development. We have been inculcated with the values of getting along with others, to gel with others, and avoid conflict during our developmental or formative years. In addition, many countries across the globe, including India, have further fostered anti-conflict image by developing national pride as a peace-loving nation. The great peacemakers who assume that it is managers' role to reduce tension, their conclusion is to initiate actions to reduce conflict, but the goal of management is not harmony and cooperation, it is effective goal attainment. What are the major sources of conflict? A number of diverse factors which can cause organizational conflict. Some factors such as incompatible personalities are psychological. That is, conflict is due to individual characteristics of employees. Some people have difficulty to get along with each other, and there is also difficulty that this difficulty has nothing to do with their requirement of job, formal interactions or task. Then our concern, however, is with structurally driven conflicts. Mutual task dependence refers to extent to which two units in an organization depends on each other for assistance, information, compliance or other coordinated activities to complete their task. This would describe, for instance, the interaction between the programming and market analysis group at a large FM radio station. The second source of organizational conflict is one-way task dependence. Conflicts are much greater when one unit is unilaterally dependent on another. In contrast to mutual dependency, one-way task dependence means that power balance has shifted. The prospects for conflicts are decidedly higher because the dominant unit has little incentive to cooperate with subordinate units. Another source of organizational conflict is assembly lines. Assembly lines have one way dependency. This can lead to conflict when one department's incomplete work is left for the next department to complete, with the dependent units in no position to retaliate. In business organizations, marketing is typically dependent on the credit department for approval of its sales. Then, high organizational differentiation is another source of organizational conflict. Greater the difference between units, greater is the likelihood of conflict. If units in the organization are highly differentiated, the task each does and the sub environment each deals with will tend to be dissimilar. This in turn will lead to significant internal differences between the units. Evidence indicates, for instance, that high horizontal differentiation leads to different goals time orientation, and management philosophies between the units. In a manufacturing firm, the employees in production will tend to have short term perspective. In contrast, laboratory researchers in the same firm will tend to have a long term orientation. Why is it so? Their training has instilled a different time perspective, and the demand for their job accentuates these orientations. Similarly, low formalization is another source of conflict. Rules, regulations reduce conflict by minimizing ambiguity. High formalization establishes standardized way for units to interact with each other. Role definitions are clear so that members of units know what to expect from each other. Where formalization is low, the potential for a jurisdictional dispute increases. Departments, for example, jockey for resources and other power bases. Then, dependence on scarce resources can also be genesis for organizational conflict. Conflict potential is enhanced when two or more units are depending on a common pool of scarce resources such as physical space, equipment, operating funds, then capital budget allocation. Centralized staff services such as typing pool, the potential is increased further if the unit members perceive that their individual needs cannot be met from the available resource pool when one unit needs are satisfied. So, differences in evaluation criteria and reward system can also be the source of organizational conflict. The more the evaluation and rewards of management emphasize the separate performance of each department rather than the combined performance, greater is the conflict. We see evidence of this in organizations all the time. The preference for production units for long economical runs with its accompanying rewards are in opposition to the rewards provided by quick delivery to good customers. Similarly, sales is rewarded for selling as much as possible. The credit unit, however, is typically rewarded for minimizing losses. The objective is achieved by curtailing sales to marginal accounts. Many a sales manager spend hours together each week trying to convince that credit firm in his or her firm that when the credit department considers a financially worthy customer is actually marginally acceptable. Line staff conflicts also stem from differing evaluation criteria and reward systems. Staff units value change, a major way in which they justify their existence. The systems department that suggests no change is likely target for elimination, but line units usually value stability. To line units, change has undesirable repercussions for their operations. Then participative decision making is another source of organizational conflict. Joint decision making, where those who will be affected by decisions are made part of the decision making body, promotes conflict. The participative process permits a greater opportunity for expression of existing disputes and allows other occasions for disagreement. Heterogeneity of members is another source of conflict. The more heterogeneous members are, the less likely they are to work smoothly and cooperatively together. It has been found that due to personal dissimilarities like background, values, education, age, and social patterns, lower the probability of interpersonal rapport between unit representatives, which in turn decreases the amount of collaboration between the respective units. So, role dissatisfaction is also one of the factors which can cause conflict, organizational conflict. Dissatisfaction can come from a number of sources, one for which status incongruence. When someone feels that she deserves a promotion to reflect her record of accomplishment, she suffers from both role dissatisfaction and perceived status incongruence. When people accept a role, they bring to it a set of hopes and aspirations. These expectations are not met when their work does not prove challenging or the rewards they receive are inadequate. So, these individuals may display frustration in a number of directions, and some resign, some choose to fight, or some reduce the effort they exert on the job. such people and all organizations have at least one seem to enjoy upsetting the system. To the degree they establish allies in their cause and they become a major source of conflict. So, concluding the discussion here, in this lecture, we have discussed about different definitions of conflict, which has been given by management researchers, and we have also learnt about the contrasting views of conflict, the traditional and interactionist view, and then we have also identified situations when managers should stimulate conflict, and finally, the discussion was about the major sources of organizational conflict. Thank you.